Welcome to HS 510 Church History Survey. My name is Andrew Russell and I will be your instructor. In this opening lecture, we want to look at two different topics, history and sources. More specifically, we need to address two questions. Who writes church history? And then what are the resources for studying church history? Let's begin with that first question. Who writes church history? When it comes to history in general, and church history in particular, there are basically two main types of sources that you need to be. The first is primary sources, and the second, secondary sources. Primary sources are really important for history. They're the indispensable component of piecing together what happened in the past. So if someone wants to write a history of a particular person, they spend a lot of time looking at things like the individual's mail, journals, the annotations in their Bible, the books they read, and so on. Secondary sources are accounts written by someone later on. So in terms of this class, the Gonzalez textbook is the secondary source. The Bentonson text is a collection of primary source. Most of the time, when you and I are studying church history, we're using secondary sources. There are a lot of reasons for that. First, there's an issue of access. Let's say you're planning on being a missionary and you want to know more about the China Inland Mission. It's not necessarily easy for you to get a hold of Hudson Taylor's mail and newsletters and sermons. You might be able to get at some of that, but most of it would require a trip to an archive. However, you can easily get a secondary book about Taylor and the mission by someone named Alvin Austin, a scholar who has spent much of his life combing through all of that primary source material. Second, we all have time limits. We need people like Alvin Austin because realistically we can't go through all of the archival material on the China Inland Mission ourselves. So because we're so dependent on professional historians, I want to take just a few minutes to consider the presuppositions and the methods of those who write history, specifically church history. History is about facts, but it's more than that. It's about interpreting those facts. Every historian's interpretive work, to some degree, is colored by the prominence that he or she gives to teleology. Historians with a robust sense of design or direction within history will naturally interpret facts and events to fit within that framework. Likewise, a lack of correlation and causation will be evident in the work of those historians who do not assume that history is following a predetermined trajectory. J.B. Bury provides an excellent example of an exaggerated teleology in the writing of history. In his book, The Idea of Progress, the assumption of progress toward the better is assumed at every turn. All complications are being smoothed out as time marches on. Here's what he says. This idea of human progress, then, is a theory which involves a synthesis of the past and a prophecy of the future. It is based on an interpretation of history which regards men as slowly advancing in a definite and desirable direction and infers that this progress will continue indefinitely. So for Bury, progress is axiomatic. He just takes it for granted that history is progressing in a particular direction, namely a positive direction. So what do you suppose is going to be potentially problematic for someone like Bury? How might that assumption affect the way he writes history? Well, at some level, it would seem as though his progressive teleology would lead him to overlook or minimize events that aren't moving along the progressive trajectory. So you can see how his teleology is going to affect the way he interprets things that are negative, catastrophic. On the other hand, you have those who reject the idea that history has a predetermined teleology. This comes especially from those who drink from the wells of postmodernity. Michel Foucault, for example, rejects the idea that you can tease out themes or trajectories within history. Let's hear from Foucault. We must renounce all those themes whose function is to ensure the infinite continuity of discourse and its secret presence to itself in the interplay of a constantly reoccurring absence. Discourse must not be referred to the distant presence of the origin, but treated as and when it occurs. In other words, he does not simply reject the use of a robust teleology in writing history. He rejects any notion of continuity within history altogether. Part of his concern here is that people are too biased or corrupted to get at what was happening in the past and then to relate it to the present. For Foucault, discontinuity is assumed as strongly as continual progress is assumed for somebody like Bury. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything about postmodernity is bad. In fact, a lot of people feel that if nothing else, postmodernity challenges the optimism of modernity. But in terms of history, I would tend to say that Foucault and others have thrown the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. To be sure, historians can make incorrect correlations and connections between the past and the present. But I would argue that a good historian can be intentional and careful in their writing of history. Of course, there are a ton of other possible presuppositions besides whether or not history has some teleology. For example, can you think of what kind of presupposition a Christian historian would have that a non-Christian historian would not? Well, if you stop and think about it, Christians believe that God acts in history, that God is involved in the world, answers prayer. Obviously, Christians don't always agree over when God is acting or what all God is causing, but the point is that Christians or theists have a particular commitment that comes into play when interpreting history. So take the Great Awakening, for example, the revivals that punctuated the American colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. A Christian might look at that and believe that the revival is an instance of the Holy Spirit convicting people and awakening them. A non-Christian historian will look at the same set of data and facts and conclude that the revival was the result of something like psychological anxiety or some kind of social need, something like that. So the point I'm trying to make here is that historians are like everyone else. They have presuppositions, and those presuppositions will affect how they read and write history for the rest of us. So that's one thing to be aware of when you are reading a monograph about some particular topic. Another important dimension of history concerns topic and material selection. Every historian is an editor. The writing of history necessarily includes a selection process of what material will be used and to what extent. He or she must also decide what material will be eliminated altogether. The Apostle John was not exaggerating when he stated that if everything Jesus did was recorded, that, quote, even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. That's from John 21. This reality is further complicated by the fact that no one possesses a complete knowledge of everything. Even the most erudite historian is selecting material from an incomplete list of data. In recent years, material selection has become a significant topic in the writing of church history. An increasing number of critics have been pointing out that past historians have not only privileged the West, but also the 4th, 13th, 16th, and 19th centuries. Likewise, the priority has been given to educated male clergymen. Here's what Gonzalez, the author of our textbook, has to say about this. The topography of the church history that I studied was almost exclusively orography. It was concerned with the mountain and mountain chains. Since the historians looked to the past as if looking from atop a mountain, what they saw was other mountain peaks, peaks often arranged along a chain stretching from the horizon to the historian's own peak. What Gonzalez is trying to get at in that passage is that people with power and privilege tend to write their history about other people with power and privilege. And for this reason, there's a new push in church history to pay more careful attention to people besides the Calvins and Luthers and Aquinas. There's more of an emphasis on accounting for what women were doing, what people not in church leadership were doing, what people more in the margins were doing. For people who write on modern Christianity, there's also growing impetus to examine Christian communities beyond the Western context and beyond the perspective of Western missionaries. Well, these calls for changing the shape of church history make excellent sense for a couple of reasons. First, the cloud of witnesses is not limited to lawyers and people good at rhetoric. Paul's insistence that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, demands that no region, the West, or status, the clergy, or gender, males, deserves precedence. If the end for which historians work is a more complete picture of the church, then attention should be expanded beyond the traditional narratives. Second, the call to examine regions beyond the North Atlantic have timely significance. Here's why. The following chart shows the redistribution of Christians from 1900 to 2000 by continent. It's taken from a book by Mark Noll. So just make some observations at the chart, and you might want to pause the video temporarily to look at it. Even if you aren't well versed in statistics, there are a couple of things here that should jump out at you. First, in 1900, over 80% of all Christians in the world lived in Europe or North America. In just over 100 years, that number dropped to 40%. So stated differently, by 2000, 60% of the Christians in the world lived outside the West. The point is, as people in general, and historians in particular, are starting to recognize this huge demographic shift, there's been somewhat of a scramble to go back and look at what happened in terms of Christian history in these areas that now hold the critical mass of Christianity. For example, in 1966, a scholar named Owen Chadwick published a book called The Victorian Church. It's a big book, 2 volumes. It's well written, it's thoroughly researched, and scholars today still call it magisterial. However, it doesn't contain any discussion of the modern missionary movement, despite the fact that the Church of England and a ton of other denominations were sending out missionaries all over the British Empire. None of that was even on Chadwick's radar screen when he wrote this book. And looking back nearly 50 years later, the absence seems almost laughable. But the point is that the current situation of Christianity demands attention on areas outside the West, and until recently, Christianity in non-Western context hasn't received much attention. Now let's talk about different types of history. Like all other academic disciplines, historians must utilize some type of methodology. They focus the research in some specific kind of way. If you've ever browsed through a Barnes & Noble, then you can find all types of histories that employ different methodologies. So there's political history and social history and economic history, and the list goes on and on. But for our purposes, I just want to highlight a few different approaches that are especially common for those who focus on the church. So the first is intellectual or theological history. These historians really focus on the cognitive dimensions of the church. What did people believe? How did they articulate their beliefs? What sorts of ideas generated the most controversy? Another type of history or approach might be called institutional history. This approach is primarily concerned with focusing on particular denominations or sects. So this type of historian will spend their time examining how an institution operated, what it did, how it changed over time, how it compared to contemporary institutions. Sometimes, especially when composed by an insider, this might be called confessional history. A lot of times a confessional history might be commissioned for an anniversary or something, and as a result you get a really squeaky clean version of the denomination that glosses over all of the warts. Not always, but often. So that's something to be aware of when you're reading confessional history. Another common approach concerns politics. As we'll see throughout the semester, the church is often concerned with politics, and there are a lot of historians who focus on this connection. A fourth approach used by those who write church history is what we might call a focus on behavior or practices. This type of approach is really concerned with what people do. In other words, how is the church lived out, so to speak? What do people do when they're together? How do they pray? How do they respond to different needs? So those are the kinds of questions that this type of historian is asking. Well, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the common approaches that historians take. Others study the church by geographical boundaries, such as the church in the South, the church in East Africa, the church in Australia. But anyway, that gives you at least an idea of the different kinds of history that you're likely to come across when you're studying the church. Now let's look at the second question. What are the resources for studying church history? If you've ever taken a course in hermeneutics, then you know that it's hard work, it's time consuming. But there are also a lot of resources for helping you do good hermeneutics. There are Bible dictionaries, encyclopedias, lexicons, concordances, Bible atlases, and a ton of commentaries. And they're all there to help you determine the meaning of a biblical text, what it meant to the original audience, and how it applies to us today. And whether you have 5 hours or 25 hours to prepare a sermon or Sunday school lesson, you want to be convenient with those resources. Life is busy, and those are tools that can help you be efficient. Well, it's the same way with church history. There are a lot of resources to help you study the church in an efficient and timely way. I want to spend a little bit of time here making sure that you all know what is available so that whether you're preparing a Sunday school class or referencing a historical event for a sermon or whatever you're doing, that you're efficient and confident that you're getting accurate information. The first resource that you should be aware of are church history dictionaries. They cost money, but they're the best first word on just about any subject in church history. Two of the most common are the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church and the Cambridge Dictionary of the Christian Church. These are really helpful for a few reasons. First of all, the articles are concise. It's the nutshell version of almost anything. Second, they're considered authoritative because the entries are generally composed by scholars who are considered experts on those topics. So if you want to get the basics about Schleiermacher or Calvin or Pietism or whatever, then you know that you're being informed by someone who knows what they're talking about. Third, dictionaries will often tell you where to look for more detailed information. So each entry of this particular text, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, contains a brief bibliography. In other words, it tells you where to go next after you've read the entry. Fourth, these resources are useful for other disciplines. For example, they include a lot of information about major topics and terms in biblical studies. Likewise, suppose you're writing a paper on the atonement for your systematic theology course. Well, these texts can help you get oriented to the topic and provide more historical background. Again, they're expensive, but they're available in the reference section, and sometimes through your Bethel Library account, you'll have access to these texts digitally. Just like there are series of commentaries on biblical topics, there are also series of works that address topics in church history. For example, there's a 5-volume Cambridge History of Christianity, and there's also a Cambridge Companion Series and a Blackwell Companion Series. These are usually a collection of essays about certain figures or movements in church history or religious history. The great thing about these types of works is that you get a good look at a topic in just 10 to 20 pages. And if you want more, the footnotes will tell you where to go next. Again, these can be really useful for other courses. So say you're writing a paper in systematic theology on sanctification. Then you might want to look at an essay or two in the Cambridge Companion to John Wesley. A book like this will give you a good sense of how the holiness or Methodist branches of Christianity have been approached. I don't ever buy these books because they're expensive, but they're in our library, and if you take a few minutes, you can usually scan a chapter or two for whatever topic you're looking at. Most academic disciplines are associated with a couple of journals. Most journals are peer-reviewed, which means that anonymously submitted articles are reviewed by experts before they're published. The point is that there's some accountability or credibility. And one of the most important journals for church history is called, appropriately, Church History. It comes out quarterly and it covers topics from the early church to the present. Again, if you have access to the Bethel website, and you all do, or the Bethel Library, then you have access to church history. There are other journals that are devoted to more specific areas. For example, the Wesleyan Theological Journal is devoted to topics that somehow relate to the Wesleyan tradition. The other component of journals, besides the relatively short length of the articles, that's really important is that there are book reviews. Books require a lot of your time, and it often happens that you invest time in a book and then in hindsight, it wasn't of much use. But if there's a book that you think might be really helpful, take a look at the book reviews in the back of the journal. Generally speaking, the reviewer will be much more familiar with the topic than anonymous commentators on Amazon. As I'm sure you know, the database Atla will help you track down articles and book reviews. Journals are often associated with conferences. So for example, the journals Church History and Missiology, they both have national and regional meetings where people meet to exchange ideas, dialogue, present papers. Obviously, you don't attend a conference because you have a paper due in 2 weeks. But if you have a long-term interest in some topic for your ministry and you want to keep current on what's going on, then there might be a conference. I regularly attend a few conferences, one that's devoted to missions history and one to holiness history. And at these conferences, I often meet people who are pastors, youth pastors, YWAM workers, and they're not necessarily academics, they're not looking to be scholars, but they want to keep current on what's going on in a particular branch of history because it's edifying or it's beneficial to their ministry. So again, conferences are something you should be aware of. That's often where new ideas are exchanged in the discipline of church history. I'll mention very briefly that the American Academy of Religion is one of the largest conferences for the study of religion in general and Christianity in particular. And this conference usually meets in conjunction with the Society of Biblical Literature. So far, everything I've mentioned costs money. At least it costs someone money. But one great resource that is free is the magazine Christian History and Biography. At least for right now anyway, these issues are available online for free. And again, the articles tend to be brief but written by experts, and they're really helpful. Here's a look at one of the covers of Christian History and Biography, and each issue usually is focused on some particular topic. Again, generally speaking, most of the historical work you do will probably involve secondary resources rather than primary resources. However, depending on the topic, you might luck out and find a large amount of good and helpful primary sources that are available for free online. For example, there are a lot of people, pastors, missionaries, scholars, who really appreciate Jonathan. A few years back, Yale University made the complete works of Jonathan Edwards available online and for free. We're talking volumes here that are all searchable. And likewise, they include all of the critical introductions that come with the print versions of of the books. Likewise, some denominations are putting their archives online. So for example, the Christian and Missionary Alliance has digitalized most of their archival material, and you can access it through the web. So in that case, say you're doing a series at church on your denominational roots, and you want to help your congregation find out about their past. There might be something available in the primary source record that you can use. So those are some of the most important resources that you'll want to be aware of when studying church history. Again, the number of hours in the day is a big deal, so I would really encourage you to utilize these types of resources so that you can maximize your time and energy and get the most out of your study of church history. Thanks for listening.